Hello everyone. This particular chapter is about MIDI, Musical Instrument Digital Interface, and this concerns OLA. So MIDI is basically stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. It is a connectivity standard for transmission of digital instruments data. It is mainly utilized by computers, electronic keyboards, and synthesizers. Synthesizers are those devices which actually produce their own sound. All right, like the software in cell phones. You may say that this Google Assistant, Apple Siri, and Amazon's Alexa, these all are synthesizer software which actually do not reproduce a pre-recorded sound, rather they synthesize their own sound. So such type of the devices before software were called synthesizers, and now the synthesizers themselves are the software. In addition, it is supported by other instruments like beatboxes, electronic drums, and even digital string instruments like guitars and violins. MIDI is a protocol. Now, what is a protocol? Protocol is a software which enforces pre-decided rules when two devices communicate. And in the case of MIDI, two digital instruments are actually communicating. So the MIDI is a protocol designed for recording and playing back music on digital synthesizers, which is allowed by many different types of personal computers nowadays. So it was invented before computers, and afterwards, when the computers started coming to markets and were adapted by people in general after their proliferation, computer sound cards are now MIDI compatible, and that is why MIDI is allowed by many different types of personal computer sound cards now. It was originally designed to control the keyboard by using another keyboard. All right, so one digital instrument device can control another digital instrument device. All right, and was quickly adapted by the personal computer, as I said. With the program, the software that offers this interface, the MIDI, you can produce music using a standard keyboard or some other input devices. You can play your MIDI creation with same program or maybe another playback program, as long as you have the card that can function as a music synthesizer. So nowadays, modern sound cards can synthesize music if it is given the MIDI notes or the MIDI commands. When a synthesizer is connected to a computer through MIDI connection, the MIDI information can be played back by transmitting the recorded MIDI notes, which are actually text commands, to the keyboard, which outputs them as audio samples such as piano or strings. And one amazing thing about it, that a MIDI recording contains both instruments and the notes played. So you can make one instrument to play the music of another instrument. The actual sound is played back using samples from the real instrument. All right. By changing the output instrument, a MIDI track for piano can also be played with the guitar or vice versa. Before, MIDI connections utilized MIDI cables. All right. You might have studied this parallel data transmission. So MIDI cables had 8 wires to transmit the data. And nowadays, since the advancement, most of the MIDI devices use USB. Although MIDI is now out of the scope, it is not being used now as much as we use MP3 and other music sound formats. One thing that you need to understand is that MIDI does not save the sound itself, rather it saves commands which are text, and those commands, when are read by the synthesizers, the devices that can reproduce the sound, then these devices produce the sound themselves. So actual sound is not saved. Everything that is saved is just the text, and that is why the size of the file for the sound is actually very small. And secondly, human produced sound is not saved. It is just for the instruments. So this particular protocol was invented and commissioned by American music industry for the production of cheaper music. All right, so let's see with the O-level perspective. Musical instrument digital interface, it's a standard protocol for the interchange of musical information between musical instruments, synthesizers, and computers. This system is associated with storage of music files, which are storing just text. No sounds are stored or transferred, but a text message or instructions called event messages that can be played by any compatible device, instrument, and for that matter, computers, sound cards having MIDI compatibility. All right. Since no music is stored, the size of the file is very small, mostly none greater than 40K. And we know that 40K for nowadays, for bandwidth that we have nowadays, the enormous bandwidth that we have nowadays is nothing. Initial disk operating system based and other old video games used to make sound using MIDI. All right, and early internet, as we know of, it was basically very slow. The bandwidth was low. And as such, there was no possibility to send actual music files which were higher in size. So these websites, which were based on that old internet connections and all, were relaying music based on MIDI, because MIDI takes less bandwidth and mostly using text event messages. Now, what sort of question would appear? The sort of question that appear related to MIDI in O-level is that how is MIDI file different from regular music file? And secondly, what is contained in MIDI files? So both answers are here. For example, if it is questioned that what is contained in MIDI file, then you could say that it contains instructions of how to make the sound for synthesizers. There is no actual audio, so none audio recording. File is not created by microphone, rather it is created using digital music instruments like keyboards, guitars, violins, organs. Sounds are produced using synthesizers in MIDI music instruments or with computer sound cards. It is not basically just the file that is being played back using speaker, like ordinary files, ordinary sound file like MP3 and all. Individual notes and instruction messages can be changed. All right, so it is just the text. The composer who actually made this whole symphony, let's say using MIDI based instruments, when musicians were playing all the instruments, the MIDI was actually recording the interaction and the music that was being played on those instruments. Once that is done, that is done. Composers do not need these humans back to replay that music. Rather, if they would like anything to be changed, they would do it themselves, because everything that was played back is now recorded in the form of text files. So if the question asks for the comparison between the MIDI file and the sound file, then you would say that sound file contains actual sound in binary form, whereas MIDI file contains instruction of how to make the sound. Sound file contains sound, whereas MIDI does not contain any sound. MIDI is created using digital music instruments, whereas the sound files are created by recording through microphone and all. Sounds are produced using synthesizers. In sound file, sounds are produced using regular sound cards, which do not need to be synthesizers, as the sound was actually played and recorded by humans using microphone means, and then it is being just replayed. It is actual. The file size of the sound file is much higher Then the file size of the MIDI file, because of the reason that sound file saves sound and the MIDI file saves text. And in sound file, it is very hard to change individual notes or instructions because it is almost impossible. So you would have to get back to the software that was used to reproduce that sound. And if it is possible, then you can change the sound in sound files. Otherwise, you would have to replay and re-record it. Whereas in MIDI files, because it is a collection of 11 different types of text commands, you can always change any note that you like. So that's it for musical instrument digital interface. And it is one of the topic that appeared like twice or thrice in past papers. And it is basically